All right, we are live now. Hello, everybody. Welcome to contract training, the fall version. Hope everybody's had a great day and a great week, and you're enjoying. I guess you get warm weather in San Diego, but we have fall weather out here where the leaves are turning a beautiful burnt orange. So I'm excited about that. So we have 4 classes. Today's class, we're going to go over the residential listing agreement, as well as the sales disclosure summary and opening documents. And then Thursday, we'll go over the buyer broker agreement and discuss what agency is. And then on next Tuesday and Thursday, it'll be 2 days of contract, the purchase agreement, because that's a rather lengthy document now. So it's going to take 2 classes to fill that. We'll go to about 4:30 today, so about an hour and a half, 90 minutes. We like to have an interactive class, so if you have questions, please raise your hand and we'll get to you. If you don't know how to raise your hand, it's in the bottom of the screen where it says, what is it, reactions? It's not popping up for me, but somewhere on there, raise your hand. Without further ado, let's get going. And I asked Mark, are you ready to go over the implementation of putting the templates into their zip forms?
Oh, I didn't know we were going to discuss that, but yeah, I think let's talk about it conceptually. Most everyone has already done this. We had migrated from a product called ZipForm Broker Edition, which was like a collaborative working environment, to all of you using your ZipForm Personal Edition, which is a single user version of the same software. And you access the ZipForm Personal Edition through the car.org website. You log into your car.org account and then you click on transactions. There's like 3 circles that you'll see on the home screen, and one of them is transactions. That takes you into your ZipForm account. So if you were to start a new transaction of any type in ZipForm, you would end up, you'd say, I want a purchase agreement or purchase transaction, or I'd want a listing transaction or a buyer representation agreement, whatever it is. You would end up with a transaction with absolutely nothing loaded into the forms. When you clicked on documents, you would see nothing except a folder called archive. So what we did was we created custom templates that you can install in your personal edition account that will preload the typical forms that you'd be using for a listing transaction, purchase transaction, and so forth. It also pre-fills some of the information into the forms for you, so it saves a lot of time rather than going in there saying, okay, you need this, and clicking on everything and loading it. So if any of you, have not yet installed that in your ZipForm Personal Edition account, why don't you write me an email and ask me for the instructions to that? Because rather than walk through it while we're in this session today, I think, most everybody can, download and install these templates on their own. And if you just email me and let me know that you need the instructions, I'll send them to you. So I'll put my email in the chat.
I'll get it for you, Mark.
I got it.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So that's a big time saver, and I'd really, recommend that you do install it, because it makes it a lot more functional.
Perfect. Thank you, Mark. Okay, let's move into, I'm going to share my screen so we can get going. First thing we're going to cover is what we call transaction opening documents. These are all the opening documents necessary to open a transaction with our office. These are the minimum for the opening, meaning if you go out and get a new purchase agreement or a new listing agreement, you would reference this. This is accessible in the KW Metro Associate folder. And so you go into that and you would look for transaction opening documents. We'll also put it in the chat box in a little bit so you can have a PDF of it, okay? We're not going to cover the top part of it, but what I want you to read on the buy side, but we're going to get the listing side. But I do want to note this. when you open up a transaction, Mark does what's called an initial review. And what we need that to be is submitted to him within 2 days after signing, 2 business days. So this includes all purchase and listing agreements, even if you have an MLS exclusion filed. So going through the listing agreement today, there's always some confusion about that. More often than not, if someone takes a listing, they think they don't need to submit that paperwork until it actually opens escrow. But always remember, whether it's a purchase agreement or a listing agreement, you still have to go through the initial phase of sending it to compliance within 2 business days, so Mark can do the initial review. Some of the documents, some but not all the documents we're going to cover today on the listing side. We won't cover the agency, but I'll breeze past the fair housing, the PRBS, the wire fraud. We're going to spend a lot of time on the residential listing agreement, and then going through some of the other advisories, the seller advisory, the consumer protection. I definitely will be reviewing the SLIC, the seller's listing information checklist, and why you need that. You need an exclusion form if it's a listing and you're not going to put it in the MLS within 24 hours. That's the rule for them. Any listing that you have to have it in the MLS within 24 hours unless the seller assigned an exclusion form for a later date. And then the MLS all fields report, a CMA that you performed for the seller, an estimated seller proceeds, which all should have been done at the listing consultation. And then market condition advisory, the affiliated business disclosure that we're required to have in both listing and purchase agreements. And then an additional agent if you have more than one agent working on the deal. And then of course, the all important AVID, agent's visual inspection disclosure for the listing agent. We'll cover that one a little bit more as well too. So what I've done is I'm going to now open up the residential listing agreement, the exclusive, and let me increase the size so you can see that. How's that for everybody? Okay, good. All right, so as Mark said, we have the templates that preload all the documents that you'll need for the initial documents loaded in, and in the listing packet, it has all these forms that are just all streamed together. So I'm not going to cover disclosure agency to agency right now on this. I'm going to cover that on Thursday because I can spend some time on that. But that would be the first form that the seller needs to sign. And then the next form after that is a new form that came out in 2020, the Fair Housing Discriminatory Advisory. This was to make sure that we operate within fair housing. So it's an advisory for every seller for them to understand what fair housing is. And some things they can and cannot say. It's like they can't tell us, well, we only want to sell it to people that are white or or Jewish or whatever. That's what this advisory is for, that we follow as NAR, as a licensed realtor, a member of NAR. We follow the fair housing, and any violation of fair housing laws may result in civil fines, injunctive relief, or compensatory or punitive damages and attorney's fees and costs. So this was a new disclosure that came out. A lot of it was during the pandemic when we were having the social unrest, and this, I'm glad they created this form. But it's to understand the protected classes. There's like 23 in the state of California, I think, but you can't discriminate someone based upon sex, race, color, ancestry, national origin, religion, orientation, gender, all those listed right there. Whole bunch of stuff. Next form is the PRBS. This is the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. So basically for this form, it's going to be also in the purchase agreement as well too, but for the sell side is a disclosure to the seller saying, hey, we're going to take your listing, we're going to market it, but we might also be marketing another listing in the neighborhood. It might be a neighbor down the street or a neighbor across the block or whatever. So we're going to still, though, give you your act as your fiduciary as a principal and make sure that we do all the things right for you. But we just need to advise you that hey, I might be selling your neighbor's home as well, too. And it does cover a little bit of dual agency, which I will cover again on Thursday. Wire fraud advisory. This is more of an important document for the buy side. I'll breeze over this really quick, but wire fraud is something that this industry is very aware of, and they're taking measures to make sure whenever somebody transfers money electronically to an escrow company, that they follow the wiring instructions given by the escrow officer only. And they're advised to obtain phone numbers and account numbers only from those escrow officers. It does say property managers because this also deals with leases, or landlords at the beginning of the transaction. Do not ever wire or electronically transfer funds prior to calling. To confirm the transfer instructions, only use a phone number you were provided previously. Do not use any different phone number or account number included in any emailed transfer instructions. And then orally confirm the transfer instruction is legitimate and confirm the bank routing number, account numbers, and other code numbers before taking steps to transfer the funds. And avoid sending personal information in emails or texts. Provide such information in person or over the telephone directly to the escrow officer, property manager, or landlord. And take steps to secure the system you're using with your email account. And I will address this right now. These steps include creating strong passwords using the secure Wi-Fi and not using free services. So here's how it happens for wire fraud. And most of this stuff originates out of Russia and China. But these people are already hacked into your email. They're already in there. You just don't know it. And especially if you're an agent. And if you're an agent, they're just kind of perusing the communication that you have going back and forth between your buyer or seller. And then all of a sudden they see open escrow and you're sending a congratulatory email to the buyer. Congratulations, your offer's been accepted. We're opening escrow. Here's all the instructions, blah, blah, blah. Well, they see that and they kind of pray in the background, watching that communication going back and forth. Until finally one day on the buy side, the buyer needs to transfer all their money and they will send for closing, and they will send an email that maybe has one letter off or one little small change in it that it looks like it's coming from the either escrow officer. And in our case, we've had wire fraud where it looked like our agent was sending the buyer the information, and the actual email stated to the buyer, "Hey, this is Agent Andy. I'm in a class all day, but I just heard from escrow that you need to wire the remaining $50,000 to the escrow company. And here are the wiring instructions. I won't be able to answer the phone because, as I said, I'm in a class, but please make sure you take care of that today so we can close escrow in time." And that was basically the gist of the email. Well, our agent was smart enough to know, the buyer was smart enough to know to contact the agent and say, "I got this email." Of course, forwarded the email to the agent and said, "No, that was not from me." So how do you safeguard this from wire fraud from happening? And I said this at Wednesday's risk management meeting. I highlighted about using your KW email address, because the KW email address is a business account and it's already secure and it has two-party verification already embedded in it. So I highly implore you to use your KW email address for all of your transactions, because it's much more secure than a regular Gmail or a, God help you if you have a Yahoo or AOL. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna just put it out there, because if you do, I'm sorry, you're laughed at by most agents when they see that. So for God's sake, use your business account. You're in business, and you should be using your business email address for all your communication, and it will just protect your files. And I apologize in advance if you have an AOL email address. Okay, so the RLA, and Mark, you just interject anytime you need to say something.
I was just going to say that, that wire fraud advisory, it may seem like it's kind of like, oh, well, that's never going to happen. But believe it or not, it happens a lot. And it's happened a number of times in our office, which we have been able to prevent it from actually occurring. But it's a real thing. It happens all the time. You hear about this in the news all the time about how people lose money by transferring it. So please be careful and tell your buyers to be very, very careful and verify any kind of instructions that they get.
Thank you, Mark. Mark, do I have an old RLA in here?
Yeah, that's the 620 version. I believe there's the 1221 is the newest.
I'm so sorry, you guys. I thought I had everything ready, so I need to go in here and delete this and re-add it. So give me a second.
Yeah, 622. That's the newest one. So you may have not followed what he just did, but forms are updated every 6 months by CAR, and so it's a really good practice for you all to never reuse an old transaction. And here's a classic example. Maybe you helped someone buy a property and now they're selling it, and you don't want to retype all that information in. Or maybe they had a listing agreement 4 months ago and it didn't sell, so they took it off the market, and now they're calling you and they want to list it again. Don't go back and reuse that old transaction, because chances are the forms have been updated they happens in June and December, and you will be reusing old information, old forms, and they're not covered by the CAR standard forms protection agreement. So you never really want to use old forms. So always a good practice to always start a brand new transaction for a new event, even if you have to copy and paste information, from your contact manager back into the new transaction. Believe me, you don't want to use old forms. For one, it's a bad practice, and two, it's going to make you look really dumb to the cooperating side. If it's a purchase agreement, you're using some old purchase agreement, they'll go, I can't accept this, it's out of date. So
that's why we update our templates. Whatever new forms come out every 6 months.
Yeah, twice a year, June and December.
Okay, so I got the right one, and actually I did that on purpose. I really wanted to put you through that. So I wanted you to understand that you need to have the most up-to-date forms. And like Mark said, don't use and copy a previous transaction, because forms are updated twice a year. So here's the RLA, revised 622, right date. At least I'm smart enough to know that. I have the date prepared as today's date. And the first thing you fill in is the seller. So there are spaces on this to do. On this top line, you could actually put 2 sellers up there. And then can you put 2 sellers on the next one, Mark?
I think that line, can't remember now if it doesn't the mouse over note say it's for seller 3, seller 4, and when you mouse over that full name of first seller. Okay, and oh yeah, there's 2 lines. So mouse over the lower line for again. So it's a seller landlord 1 and 2 names. So you can put 2 names in there. If you go ahead and click in there on the second line, you'll see the first bar that's highlighted right now is the first seller, John Smith. And then if you click in the second line that's not highlighted, that's the second seller, Mary Smith.
And that's a recent update, because we used to just squeeze everybody's name into one line if there were more than 1 seller. And I didn't prepare for the entity, but we're going to just go regular seller named John Smith. We'll cover that entity a little bit later, but if you do have someone that's an entity, meaning they're part of a trust, they're a trustee for a trust, or they're part of an LLC or a corporation, you would actually input the corporate, the legal name of that entity in here, correct, Mark?
Yeah, you'd use an entity name because an entity is, may hold title or may not hold title. Let's just say like for an LLC or a corporation, that entity would hold title, but that entity is not a person. A person has to sign on behalf of an entity. So it's kind of like if you had received a check from someone and it said the John Smith Trust in the signature field, your bank wouldn't cash that because it's not the signature of a person. It's not John Smith signing it. It's an invalid signature. So we'll get more into detail on that probably when we cover the purchase agreement. But just remember, if you're dealing with an entity, you have to have the name of the representative that's representing that entity be the signer, and the entity is the actual party to the agreement.
Thank you, Mark.
Simple explanation.
Yeah. And then the next entry is hereby employs and grants Keller Williams San Diego Metro as broker. Please remember, don't put your name there. The listing is held by the broker. Okay. And then beginning date and ending date. So we're going to go with today's date as the beginning date. Let's talk about, well, how long do you take a listing for? And this one I could do, I don't know, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. Most people will take a listing for 6 months. In this market we're in right now, I highly recommend 6 months, especially if you think you're taking the listing that is overpriced and the seller will not budge on their price. You're going to need some stronger marketing. You're going to need some lengthier time of the listing agreement to hold that seller accountable if it's not selling, but give you time to get the property sold. And again, it all depends on the property too. If you've got a property that's competitively priced, high commodity, high demand, and it's that sweet spot in San Diego, it's a single family home, which was one of the things that really a lot of people wanted to buy 6 months ago. And it's still true today. So, because we still are very low, we have lower inventory than normal, and we're still kind of considered kind of a seller's market in some cases. I think
there was kind of a guideline that we used in the past where you would structure your listing period based on what the market time was for that price point in the MLS. Like if homes were selling typically within 60 days or something like that, or time on the market, you'd want to have the listing period be able to account for that. But currently in our market, we're having a lot of buyer's remorse and buyer cancellations. So when you're talking to a seller, you have to explain that there's a possibility that the first buyer that comes along might cancel, and then we'd have to start all over and find a second buyer. And so that justifies having a little bit longer of a listing period. I think 6 months is probably reasonable. Most sellers, some sellers will say, okay, 6 months is fine, or a year is fine. But some other sellers will say, well, I don't want to commit for that long because, you're having to prove to them that you're doing your job, and they may not want to make a long-term commitment like a year. So the goal for you as a listing agent is to secure the listing, but you have to use these explanations to say, well, here's how long I think it should be based on what's going on in our market right now.
And a longer listing period could work against you, especially if you're taking it and it's overpriced and it's sitting on the market.
Yeah.
Then you want to, what agents call, refresh a listing. In other words, they want to get rid of this listing and put a brand new listing on the MLS, but you can't have a listing and cancel that listing, but the length of the period is 30 days before you can relist it. So you're stuck with a 6 month listing period unless you went in and did a modification of terms of the listing agreement, change the listing period date to a shorter date, and then have the listing completely canceled out of the MLS as expired, and then do a whole brand new listing agreement.
As listing agents, I'm sorry, Robert, didn't mean to step you there. As listing agents encounter these situations where the property is not getting any offers and things like that, contact us or your coach for a strategy on how best to handle these things. We have a lot of experience and we can offer some suggestions that you might not have thought of.
With the coaches at our coaches meeting today, we're providing some great training through the end of the year on pricing strategy.
Cyril has a question, Robert.
Yeah, Cyril, go ahead.
Hey, hello everyone. It's good to see you, Bob and Mark and everyone else. Thank you for addressing me here. I do have a question. I do have a listing that's coming to the end of the 6-month listing agreement. We just opened escrow, and I have 2 questions. If it come, we're right at the end over here, and the listing agreement end date is November 9th. And we're scheduled to close on the 10th.
You need to do a modification of terms of that listing agreement and extend it
Okay.
past the close date, and then also then go into the MLS and change the expiration date.
Got it.
Otherwise, it will expire out, and you won't be able to go in and fix it. They'll have to do it for you. So yeah, get that done, taken care of.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. That was my first point of talk. And the second one is, if we come out of escrow and it falls out because of a reason or another, and I do have to extend on the listing, what about the disclosures? Are the disclosures still good for that long? Do they have to be redone after a specific amount of time? What's the deal on that?
If you think about it, disclosures are typically completed by the seller prior to the time an offer is received. So they're always going to be dated, after the listing agreement effective date, but before the purchase agreement effective date. So the first buyer falls out and maybe they've been in escrow for, 30 days or something like that. Do I have to redo my disclosures? Well, not really, unless the seller has new knowledge of material facts and they learned something new about the property and they want to amend the disclosures. So there's 2 ways to handle it. You have an amendment or a correction to make or an additional disclosure to make, or you want to just restate that nothing's changed. So in the first one, you could do an amendment to the disclosure and say, the seller also discloses this, whatever. And then in the second situation where you're not making any changes, but you want the buyer to know that these disclosures created 60 days ago are still accurate, you can do an addendum that says the seller states that nothing has changed on the disclosures since they were created on 60 days ago, whatever that date was. So 2 ways to handle older disclosures that the seller has done. Yeah, they can be reused. They don't have to be re-prepared.
Well, thank you, Mark. And that sounds like out of good practice and courtesy as well, if I may say. Is there a standard per California law that after a specific amount of time, you would have to revisit those disclosures automatically and make sure that they are addressed?
With regard to seller disclosures, and typically we're talking about the TDS, the SPQ, things like that. Those don't really time out. An NHD report that is like 60 or 90 days old may need to be reissued. So if you obtained a natural hazard disclosure report, at the time the listing began, and it's now 3 or 4 months later, you might want to contact that NHD company again and say, hey, look, can you verify that nothing's changed? Like my property wasn't in a fire zone, but now it is in a fire zone or something like that. So the NHD has a certain timing on it. And I think that the general rule is 90 days, but it could be as short as 60 days. If it's old, let's just say 60 days, I would double check with the NHD company to make sure nothing has changed.
Wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen.
And the easier answer too, I'm going to give an easier one. If there's you can use the old disclosures, and if there's anything new that the seller needs to disclose, like, I don't know, the place flooded last week, just amend the disclosure and send over that as a disclosure in a document.
Makes sense. Thank you.
All right, and then you're gonna put in the property address. I've already auto-filled one in here. And then city of San Diego, county of San Diego zip code, and then the assessor parcel number. The APN number, of course, you get off of the tax records that you access through your MLS membership, where you go in and put in the address and find the APN number. This is not the APN number for this address, but you will take that APN number from the tax records. And then the next box is this property is a manufactured mobile home. It's not, but if it was, you would check this box and it would import a form called the MHLA. It's a mobile home listing addendum. And then, or this property is being sold as part of a probate, conservatorship, guardianship, or receivership. You check that box, and then now there's a probate listing addendum and advisory that would automatically populate. If you want to sell a trailer, go ahead. It's not like selling a house, it's like selling a car. So it's a little bit different. It's
Most
and
of
we
our
do have a system set up for that.
most of our agents who have done a manufactured home sale after it's completed say that they will never do another one.
Yeah.
So it's a unique property type. And on the second box, I wanted to make a comment about probate, conservatorship, guardianship, or receivership. Those types of transactions have some special rules as well that are set by law. One that is real common is that a probate listing cannot be for longer than 90 days initially. It can be extended after 90 days, but the periods that you see their beginning date and ending date cannot exceed 90 days on a probate listing. So again, when you have some kind of specialty transaction that's not, cookie cutter normal, reach out to your coach, to us, for help and guidance on those types of transactions.
And then most definitely though, broker guidance is if you've never done a probate, you're going to have to learn a lot of the stuff. My suggestion is team up with someone that's done a probate, because there's a lot of navigation that needs to happen. And Kareen's shaking her head on this. She just recently closed a probate and was one of her first or second, but she had to do a lot of extra learning on the side because it is a little bit different than just selling a regular house. Sometimes the court involved, it's not involved. You got multiple parties. It can be kind of a mess. So it's not an easy sale. Okay. Then the next is going to be the purchase price. So we're going to sell this for 1.2 million. And then you see it auto-populated in written out in longhand. So 1.2 million is the sell price. And then any listing terms could be, I mean, Mark reviews a lot more of these, so I don't know what he'll see, but I would think you would put something like no showings on Sundays. Only showings if the sky is blue. Stuff like that.
Another, things that, listing agents could be, providing value added services. And, maybe actually this is the compensation section. So this is not actually the best place to put that.
Yeah.
But it could be, that the seller agrees to pay for staging, and the staging is $1,000. So it would be, 6%. And staging costs not to exceed $1,000. That's a negotiable item between the seller and the listing agent. That's where you would use that 3A and section.
Okay. All right, let's talk about compensation, because that's why you guys are in the business. You want to make money and get paid. It's important to note that whenever there's something bolded on the contract, that means it's super duper important. And in this case, it's that real estate commissions are not fixed by law. So meaning it's negotiable between you and the seller. That said, as an office, you can't go and advertise as a discount broker though, and only do 1% sale listings, because it's against our franchise agreement with Keller Williams. So marketing as a discount broker is prohibited. However, that said, sometimes you might need to give a deal to a seller for whatever reason. Maybe it's the 5th or 6th home that they've had you sell this year, or maybe they're gonna sell and then buy with you. And so they want a reduction on the sell price because they know you'll make it up on the purchase price. Any number of reasons could happen. Just know you can't go out and market as a discount, but you can charge as much as you want. And I think 6% as a standard rate is a deal. I think you guys are worth 10% on all of your transactions because you work really hard. But the industry's not caught up to my belief system, and I have no idea why. I've been tuning that horn for a long time that you guys need 10%. So for this transaction, the 3A, you put in the entire amount of commission. That means what you're going to keep and the amount that you're going to give to a buyer's agent. Because this is important right here, because here's what happens. People think they only need to put in what they keep up here. So if they take a 6% listing, they think they need to put 3% up here and then 3% down below, and I'll cover where that is. But don't do that. Otherwise, you're working for free because you just basically gave away the entire 3% to a buyer's agent. Or you got to go get it fixed, and the seller is kind enough to sign it. So 6% of the listing price, or if a purchase agreement is entered into of the purchase price, or you can also do a dollar amount. And we see the dollar amounts with mobile homes because mobile homes are worth less money, are usually lower priced. And a 6% of a mobile home of $50,000 doesn't go very far. But at $10,000 on a $50,000 mobile home will go far.
The trick to this 3A is to always remember that it is the sum of the two sides of the transaction. So like Robert was saying, the 3D is the other section down below, and he'll scroll down to that just in a moment. But always make sure that what is displayed in 3A is the sum of 3A and 3D, meaning the buyer, or excuse me, the seller might say, well, it says 6% up here in 3A and 3% down in 3D. Am I paying 9%? And the answer is no, because when we get to 3D, you'll see that it says that the listing broker is going to pay the selling broker out of the amount in 3A. So it's a common mistake to only put your listing agent portion of the commission in 3A, but it should be the total of 3A and 3D. Sorry, I have a flyer here in front of me.
No problem. Thank you, Mark. Okay, section 3A1. This basically covers in a nutshell, says that the seller will be responsible to pay us the commission when we get a ready, willing, and able buyer to make an offer on any price or terms that's acceptable by the seller, provided the buyer completes the transaction, or even if the buyer is prevented from doing so by the seller, meaning the seller decides, I don't want to sell, I'm not closing escrow. We could be entitled to this compensation. Now, as a broker, have I ever enforced this? Or brokers, do they enforce this? Typically, no. And I sit on risk management committee with SGR, and most of us, we talk about this. Most brokers are not going to go after a seller because they breached an agreement on a purchase agreement with a buyer, and then now we think they owe us the money. They just don't do it because the legal expense to do it. And typically what happens is if we're in mediation, we're mediating and we're coming to an agreement, and it's typically not worth it financially. But that's what that's basically what it says though. Let's say it was a multi-million-dollar home and it was a $250,000 commission. We probably will go and enforce that. So 3A2. This section covers that there's a certain time frame after a listing period expires or an extension thereof, that if anybody that has come into the property who physically entered it or was introduced by a cooperating broker, et cetera, if they buy it after it expires within a certain amount of time, that the seller would then be responsible to pay us the commission. So here's an example. Buyer comes into a home, the seller just happens to be there. It's a 6-month listing. It's about to expire next week. seller says to the buyer, hey, come back next week, my listing's expired, and I'll sell it to you at a better price. I'll reduce the whatever the commission is. You just make me the offer. It's to prevent stuff like that, so that they don't go around your back during the listing period or after with agreed upon time for any of those buyers that came into the property. Item 3A3, or if without broker's written consent, the property is withdrawn from sale, conveyed, leased, rented, otherwise transferred, or made unmarketable by a voluntary act of the seller during the listing extent period or any extension. So basically the seller burns the house down, can't sell it. So they could be responsible. Would we pursue it? It would have to be a case-by-case basis. Section B. This addresses if a sale was prevented by a party to the transaction other than the seller. In other words, let's say the buyer breached the agreement and the seller decides they're going to sue that buyer, and they actually win and they recover damages. Well, then there's an amount that we could recover. It's lesser of 1/2 of the damages recovered or the above compensation after first deducting title and escrow expenses and expenses of the collection. So have I ever pursued that? No, because most sellers decide not to go and pursue legal recourse with a buyer that breaches the agreement because it's just too expensive hiring attorneys to do all that, and sometimes they won't even win the case. Item C, in addition, seller agrees to pay broker. Now, where you could put here is, let's say the seller will offer a $10,000 bonus to a cooperating broker if they bring a buyer and they get an escrow within a certain time frame. You could put that section right here. So $10,000 payable to cooperating broker as a timed selling bonus. Section D then now addresses how we're going to pay the buyer broker. And that's really what this is. So that's where Mark talked about, you put the 3%, or you can put a dollar amount as well too. So in this case, the full listing is at 6% and we're paying 3% to the cooperating broker. And then item 2 says the broker is authorized to cooperate with and compensate brokers operating outside the MLS as per broker's policy. So what that basically addresses is they're giving us the authority if we have an agent that comes and makes an offer on this listing, but they're not a member of our MLS. And our policy is we will cooperate with those brokers on the outside if they're bringing a buyer. But you just need to include the form that's called they will need to include the form, the cooperating broker compensation, to confirm the amount of commission. Section E just basically says that the seller hereby irrevocably assigns the broker all of the above compensation. And I think I saw a hand. Did I see a hand? Kareem?
I was
No,
what's that?
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Corinne.
Oh, I was just going to say, and if you do a modification of terms, and I've had this happen before, fortunately I caught it, but don't forget to, let's say you originally had 6% total and you're reducing it to 5%. Don't forget to change the cooperating broker part, because otherwise.
Kareem. You didn't do that.
She brings up a good point, and
No, I didn't actually do it, but it was something I was conscious about.
Oh, good.
No, I didn't do it, but I want others to know, to be aware of it, because that would be not a good thing if that happened.
But one of the things I always mention to agents when they, see modifications of terms is they, tend to get somewhat verbose or vague in writing what the change is supposed to be. So if the changing in commission, I always say, use the RLA section, the 3A, 3D. RLA 3A will be 5%, changed from 6%, or RLA 3D will be 2.5%. So mention, the section number when you're writing a modification of terms to change a listing agreement. Always, that's a good practice, even in counter offers, just to say, our purchase agreement section, 3P1 is, changes to this. Reference the section numbers when you're making revisions to an agreement.
I actually pulled up the chat box and I see Sean Breedlove is asking a question. Joined a little late. Can someone tell me how to access these forms? All these forms are accessible through your personal zip forms.
I did respond to him privately, Robert. Sorry about that.
Okay, got it. Perfect. Next section, section F. Seller represent the seller is not previously entered into in a listing agreement with another broker regarding the property unless specified as follows. So this would be important, especially if you are prospecting to expired listings and you're going after expired listings. You need to know what is in that listing agreement. Even if it didn't expire, maybe it was canceled by the other broker. You need to get one or two things. You need to get if it's expired, fantastic, but were there certain things that that listing agent did they provide a list of all those names of people that entered the property during their listing period? And does this seller have to pay them that fee? So, but is there a cancellation of listing that they got from a previous broker? Great, you need to have a copy of that so you can see whether or not that seller would owe that a commission to that previous broker. So that's where you would put it here. Or section 2 is maybe you want to sell it to your cousin Guido. Cousin Guido wants to buy it, but he's not quite ready. He keeps telling me he wants to buy it, but just in case he wants to buy it, I want to be able to sell it to him without using you. You can put a name of cousin Guido in here right now and exclude him from this listing agreement, meaning if finally cousin Guido gets his shit together and gets pre-approved or comes us with the cash, you can then sell, the seller can then actually sell it to cousin Guido.
And 3F1 just came up yesterday in the brokerage. We had a situation where an agent signed a listing agreement and it was still under contract with another broker.
In contingent status in the MLS, but we got that one taken care of. It was a simple fix, and the agent knew about it in advance anyway. So, item F, it's sold to anyone listed above that's obligated to compensate the broker. Broker is not entitled to compensation under this agreement. So what this basically says, if we put a broker or other names into this section F1 or F2, then if it's sold to them, then we're not entitled to receive commission on that. For A, this talks about items excluded and included, and I mentioned this on last week's risk management meeting. This is a big bone of contention on escrows, believe it or not. I still get the calls. Broker Bob, the seller took the fountain in the backyard, my buyer's mad. So what is an item excluded and included? So an excluded would be something that's considered personal property. Included is typically real property, meaning it's attached to the land. Once something's attached to the land, it becomes real property. But there could be a gray area where you don't know if it's attached or not. So is it real? Is it personal? So you need to have a really good, frank conversation with the seller because you've done a tour of the property and you just happen to notice maybe they had a water fountain sitting on the terrace that was plugged into the wall. Case could be made that that's real. A case could be made that it's personal. But it's better to have clarity during the listing period and ask the seller, hey, are you going to take that water fountain with you when you leave? And the seller says, no, I want to leave it here. Great, then we'll include it. But if they want to take it, then we need to exclude it. And then in our MLS listing, we need to also exclude that water fountain if it's quasi real or personal. Other items would be leased or not owned items. like a solar system, alarm system, propane tank, water softener, or liened items, meaning they have a note on it. They're actually, a lease is where you have lease payments, and a lien is typically where you're buying them. The following items have been financed on a lien. So solar systems, windows or doors, heating, ventilation, air conditioning system. And when they say liened items, the person that installed them actually has a lien on that property, specifying those items. So seller will provide to buyer as part of the sales agreement copies of lease documents or other documents obligating seller to pay for any such leased or liened item. So this is important. When you get this listing agreement, you need to get those lease documents, sales agreements, whatever, so you can get them to escrow, and escrow can figure out if it's a leased solar system. Does the seller have to pay it off before they close escrow, or the buyer can assume? Is it a PACE or HERO loan? So there's a lot of nuances with that. So my advice is, if you go to a house and you see these things on the roof that look like they're pointing towards the sun, they're probably a solar system. Ask that seller, do you own that? Are you leasing it, or what is it? Great, let me see your paperwork. Pull it out. You should actually have these questions answered prior to you going to the listing consultation. As part of your pre-qualification questions for the seller, is asking that question. By the way, do you have a solar system? Great. Is it leased or owned? Great. Can you please have your paperwork there when I visit you tomorrow to discuss the sale of your property? Section 5 talks about the multiple listing service. What is it? So I'm not going to go into great detail on this, other than you are all a member of the MLS, but the MLS basically allows us to take a listing, put it into the MLS, and then market it directly to the real estate community. Item B, though, is what information is provided to the MLS. All terms of the transaction, including sales price and financing, if applicable, will be provided to the MLS in which the property is listed, and dissemination and use by person entities on the terms approved by the MLS, and may be provided to the MLS even if the property was not listed with the MLS. Seller consents to broker providing a copy of the listing agreement to the MLS if required by the MLS. So if you do an exclusion form, then yeah, you're going to have to provide a copy of the exclusion form, and in some cases, the listing agreement. Our MLS in this form is the SD MLS, which is, if you're a member of the San Diego Association of Realtors, then it's SD MLS. If you're a member of PSAR or North County Board, then you are a member of CR MLS. So if you're not an SCR member, you need to put in CR MLS because you're probably a member of the South Bay or North County. Six addresses the benefits of using the MLS, but also the impact of opting out of the MLS. Some sellers don't, and this happens once or twice a month, maybe. I'll get a call from an agent that says the seller wants to list the home, but they don't want to put it in the MLS. Well, NAR came up with a clear cooperation policy a couple of years ago that specifically addresses that if you are a member of NAR, which you all are, you're required whenever you take a listing to enter that listing into the MLS within 24 hours or on the agreed upon exclusion date. If you don't do that, then you could be fined. Also, what happens if a seller does not want to put it in the MLS and they want to exclude it for the entire listing period, which has happened, then you as the agent can't market that property to outside agents. You can only do it internally. And it's best to make sure that the agency disclosure form has been given to any one of your clients or any other agent within our office, their clients as well too, because that creates agency. So if we have agency created with potential buyers on a property that won't be on the MLS, we can actually show them that property. We just can't put it in the MLS because the seller doesn't want it. But this section then addresses the impact of opting out of the MLS and advises the seller, hey, the MLS is a powerful tool. It's really important that you get the most exposure possible that you can for your property to help the wider range of audience see it and hopefully get more money for your home. So it's important to have the conversation about this section if they don't want it on it and understand what the implications could be. Because you don't want them coming back after they sold it to somebody and they discover that they sold it for a lot less than they could have because other buyers were really interested in this property. So that's what this section addresses.
I do have a question, Bob.
Yeah.
The question is, if the property is not on the MLS, you're not allowed to advertise it to the public.
Yes.
Can you still advertise one-on-one to another agent that's not part of the brokerage?
Nope. Nope. You can only advertise it to someone that's interested in purchasing it, and they've signed an agency disclosure form. You've provided them with an agency disclosure form.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Section 7 discusses the clear cooperation policy. This MLS does require that anything 1 to 4 units or vacant lot listings be submitted within 1 business day of any public marketing. What is public marketing? It's included but not limited to flyers, displays in windows, yard signs, digital marketing, all that within there. And then item C addresses coming soon status, impact on marketing. So coming soon status is a pricing strategy or a marketing strategy. But let's say that we want to entice the market that something's new. I have a new listing, but it's not ready to show. So there's something called coming soon. And the coming soon will allow you to put it on the MLS in coming soon status. It will be fed out through all the IDX feeds, and it will show up on Zillow and Realtor.com and all those sites, but you just can't show the property yet. So buyers can't come in and see it. You can't show it to other agents with buyers. You can't do any of that. If you did it, then you have to put it live as active in the MLS within 24 hours. So the coming soon status is a really good tool if you want to get some pre-marketing and get some buyer interest. You just can't show it. And then it automatically, with our MLS, at 21 days, it automatically converts to active. So make sure you know that. A lot of agents will take coming soon with, let's say, properties that need to have some work done on it. And item D addresses the authorization to exclude. You can put in the date here, great. If they don't want to MLS right away, you can put November 3rd, but then you also have to bring in the SELM form or the SJR. They have an equivalent form. It's called the authorization to exclude form. Either form is fine. You don't need both. You only need one or the other. And then sections, sorry, 7D, 7(2). Okay, sorry, I'm reading through this. This addresses again the section E is when the seller is aware that if we do any public marketing and you decided to exclude it from the MLS, we're required to put it in the MLS within about 1 business day. And then section F, clear cooperation policy does not apply. That box will never be checked because our MLS subscribes to the clear cooperation policy. Section 8 talks about MLS data on the internet. So what this basically does is, hey, Mr. Seller, we're going to take your property, put it in the MLS. We're going to take pictures. It's going to go out to the Ethernet and the interwebs. Everybody's going to see it. And we have no control over that. You know, as a member of the SCMLS, we're required to actually submit that, but then they have ownership of all that information on there, including the pictures. So once we submit that, we can't block or control what sites see or don't see. That's all determined by the local MLS. It also addresses on item 8B2, one for viewers to comments and reviews on those sites. We don't have any control over that. And also the estimated value sites like the Zestimate or Redfin has an estimate. We have no control over that unless we can specifically exclude from the MLS. They can put whatever they want. Item 9 addresses that the seller is representing that there's no notice of default on the property. They're not delinquent on any loan. They're not in any bankruptcy or similar proceedings. There's no litigation or arbitration, administrative action on or pending threat of action that affects the property or the seller's ability to transfer it, and any current pending or proposed special assessments affecting the property. Seller shall promptly notify us in writing if the seller becomes aware of any of these items during the listing period or any extension. Section 10, A, B, and C, and D is basically your job description. So I don't want to go through this word for word. I'll just kind of breeze through a few things, but Section 10A gives the broker responsibility and authority and sets what our limitations are. Item 10B is presentation of offers. We're required to present all offers to the seller, even through escrow, until the property closes escrow. And then Section C addresses what we call the buyer supplementary offer letters or buyer letters. They're referred to as buyer letters or love letters. It's a practice that has happened where a buyer will, especially in the hot market, the buyers were desperate to get an escrow. So they were doing whatever they could to tell a seller, why sell your home to me? That's a buyer love letter. So, but you got to be really careful with these love letters, and CARD has an advisory on it, NAR has, that you don't want to do a buyer love letter that can violate the fair housing laws. So you got to be really careful. So Section C2, if you check that box, then the seller instructs the broker to present these buyer love letters. But the broker advises seller that buyer letters may contain information about protected classes or characteristics. My recommendation, don't do the love letters.
We had one situation where the buyer's dog wrote a letter to the sellers, telling the sellers how much he liked the backyard and really wanted to, make it his backyard. Serious.
Sorry, I'm getting an important question I need to answer. Mark, can you cover E?
They're on mute. Investigations and reports. So the seller has to make complete and provide to the buyer certain reports and disclosures within a certain period of time. So, as a listing agent, it's a really great idea for you to be proactive and get these things done as soon as possible. So this section talks about those different types of things. And also it's something that, a seller can order in advance in anticipation of answering a buyer's question. Why would a seller do that? Well, they might know that they need a structural pest control report, AKA termite report, because they haven't had any termite work done on the property. And they want to make sure that the buyer doesn't walk away knowing that that's going to be a big, expense for the buyer if they buyer has that inspection done on their own. They might just cancel when they see a large expenditure needed for a repair like that. So a seller can order that report in advance. And, and again, there's another checkbox there, general property inspection. That doesn't happen too often, but a seller could even order a general property inspection with the goal being, tell me everything that's wrong with my house. I want to fix it within reason, because I want the buyer to buy it. I don't want the buyer to be in escrow for 17 days and then cancel. I want to sell my house. So a seller could be proactive by doing some of these things in section 10E in advance. And so that's what this section basically talks about, obtaining homeowner association documents, preliminary title report, and so forth.
You will rarely, though, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, ask for the seller to get the HOA docs in advance, because if they pay for that and then it doesn't sell for 3 months, and you got more documents that you need to get from the HOA, especially if there's more meeting minutes of the HOA meeting.
Yeah, those certain things on there are there to cover. These forms are statewide forms, so they're designed to cover scenarios everywhere in the state of California. So, our custom and practice in this market may not, include that, but in another market they might. But Robert brings up a good point that, some of these things would be checked, some of them won't be checked. And I think talking to your coach about, what custom and practices for a listing would probably be a good idea. In regard to this section, Robert?
Yeah. And I also think, if you're representing a seller on a, shall we say, seasoned property, so something like a cute South Park bungalow or North Park Craftsman, they're older homes. So older homes have been exposed to the elements, so they might have some wear and tear on them. I always think it's a good idea as a general practice, if you're going to represent sellers on older, more seasoned properties, that you convince the seller to get a general property inspection and a pest control report, just so they know from an independent third party what they're going into and what any potential buyer will uncover. And then you, as the seller and the listing agent, then can provide those reports in advance of anybody making an offer. Because here's what happens: property gets sold, buyer goes in, does their inspection, and they find out a whole litany of stuff that's wrong with the property. And then they decide they want to cancel the transaction because there's just too much wrong with the house. Well, if they had a general property inspection report in advance, where they can see what exactly another home inspector came up with, then they're going to make their offer based upon that, because they know what's wrong with it already. So it's kind of like bulletproofing your transaction if you're representing a seller on an older home. Section F addresses that the seller will hold us, indemnify and hold us harmless if the seller decides to hide conditions of the property and they're being sued by somebody. Since we're not a party to the transaction, the seller's agreeing that, hey, if I conceal something from you and then it's later discovered that I concealed it and the buyer decides to sue me, well, they can't come back and sue us too. Section 11, you'll never use. It talks about a deposit that allows us to hold the deposit on the seller's behalf. We don't trust law because we don't deal with this. But again, it's in this form. As Mark said, this is a statewide form. Some brokerages have their own in-house. They actually can take deposits. Or this form is also for a lease agreement as well too. And some property management companies actually have trust logs and trust funds. 12 addresses agency relationships. Again, it just pretty much goes over each agency, which we will cover on Thursday. 13 is security insurance, showings, audio and video. It basically says that we're not responsible for any loss or damage to the property during the listing period. We will have a lockbox on the property. Third parties included but not limited to appraisers, inspectors, who's going to enter the property may have access. And they might take videos and photographs of stuff. you as a seller need to take reasonable precautions to protect your valuables. Hide your prescriptions if you have them. If you have expensive art, maybe you consider putting it in storage. Don't leave out your fancy jewelry because people will be coming into your home. And also to protect, make sure you have enough insurance to help protect against these risks. We don't have an insurance policy that will kick in for something like this. This is all your responsibility. And then the other thing is too, if there's a closed circuit camera, the very last sentence here, sellers advised to post notice disclosing the existence of security devices. So this was something new that came into effect. It's against the law to record somebody in the state of California without their knowledge. So with the Ring doorbell or security cameras on the inside that are recording people's activities, just a simple sign is necessary for the seller. This home is under security surveillance, and you may be recorded via video. Those should be posted prominently throughout the house. Section 14 addresses the photographs and internet advertising. And it basically says to the seller, we're going to take pictures of the property. It's going to go to the MLS. Once it goes to the MLS, we have no control of those pictures anymore. And you are agreeing to that, and you can't come back and ask us to get them deleted. Usually what happens is a buyer will buy a house and they'll call us and say, we want you to remove those pictures. We can't, the MLS can. So the buyer can petition the MLS to remove them and see if they will do that. 15 addresses a lockbox, if you're going to put a lockbox on the property or not. Hopefully you do have a lockbox on the property, and who will access this is what is addressed in here. 16 is if you're going to put a sign or not put a sign. Make sure if you put a sign that you have the ability to put one, especially if it's within an HOA. Know the rules of the HOA. Each HOA might allow a certain sign in the front post in the front yard, or maybe they only allow a sign in the window, or maybe they allow no signs. 17 addresses. This is all about equal housing. The property is offered in compliance with federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws. 18 is attorney fees. If any of us end up suing each other, each are responsible for paying their own attorney's fees and costs, unless one person was deemed at fault and the neighbor to be responsible. Additional terms, if it's an REO, we don't have those, a lot of those yet. If it's a short sale, if it's a trust, you need to attach the trust advisory. So you check that box and it'll bring that form into your templates. And then seller intends to include a contingency to purchase agreement property as part of the resulting transaction. So if you check this box right here, then there's a form called COP that will automatically. So this is a buyer or seller that wants to sell, and then they want to go out and find a replacement property. So they're going to need probably on that replacement property of contingency of purchase, but on a counteroffer, they're going to need to any buyer, a seller purchase of replacement property to be used in the counteroffer.
This section would actually be the SPRP form rather than the COP. The COP would be for the buyer. The SPRP would be seller's purchase of replacement property. So the seller can ask the buyer to provide a contingency. I want to make sure that I find another property before I sell you my property. The reverse of that is the buyer using this form called contingency for sale of other property, and where they're saying, I have to sell this other property in order to buy your property. So if you get confused on that, just ask. That's what we're here for.
And then the next section is the affiliated business disclosure, the market conditions advisory. And of course, this is an old template because I'm actually in Zip Form Broker Edition. But Mark, we don't require the RLA anymore, do we?
Yeah, those are the number 3, they're outdated forms. And so we'll check on that and make sure that's not part of the template.
But you need to provide at contract consummation. In other words, when the seller is signing this listing agreement, you provide the affiliated business disclosure, which says we have an affiliate relationship with our escrow company, which is Partners Escrow, as well as affiliates with Keller Mortgage and Movement Mortgage. And it's just an advisory. It doesn't mean you're using them. It's just an advisory. And then the market conditions advisory is attached. Section 20, management approval. This is why you need to submit to Mark within 2 business days. I, as the broker, can decide that I don't want you to have this listing. So where would this pop up? Well, let's say you take a business listing to sell a business. We don't do business sales in our commercial division. It's a different sale. So this will give me the ability to cancel the listing agreement that you have with this seller. 21 addresses the successors and assignees. This agreement shall be binding upon seller or any of their successors and assigns. 22 addresses dispute resolution. So if a seller decides to breach the agreement and get out of the listing agreement, and when previously we talked about, well, what happens if we want to go after the money that we think they owe us because we said if you prevent us from selling the property, we want to recoup some of that investment. We agree to go to mediation. Mediation is cheaper than going to court. So that's the first step that would take. And that's what this section addresses. It allows us to mediate our differences. I've only been in mediation once with a seller, with one of our agents, and we came out vindicated, but we did come ahead financially. So I have a serious conversation with an agent now if they really want to pursue a seller for payment of a commission by them being prevented from selling that home. Then we have a serious conversation about what that will include. The attorney fees ate up the entire amount we got. So basically it was a wash. 23 addresses, this is the entire agreement. No other agreement exists. 24 addresses that the seller warrants that they have the authority to sell the property. And that they are the legally authorized signer of the property, section 25. And then by signing below, seller acknowledges that seller has read, understood, and received a copy of and agrees to the terms of this agreement. And then right here, entity sellers.
Hey, Robert, before you go into that section, could you scroll back up a little bit?
Sure. How far?
There was a little bit further. I think it was the previous paragraph there. Okay, 22C. There, this is an arbitration advisory section, and this agreement does not involve binding arbitration. Brokers in California are no longer required to participate in binding arbitration as a means of dispute resolution. But this agreement can be amended if a broker chooses to do so. We do not choose to do so. So you would never, ever, ever use this form ARB that's being referred to here in 22C. If you ever see that in any way, shape, or form, don't sign it, or don't let your client sign it or anything like that. I mean, your client wouldn't sign it, but it would, it's just not used. So I just wanted to point that out, that ARB form is never, ever used.
I totally didn't want to address that, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I really didn't want to talk about it. All right. Where were we?
We're in entity sellers.
All right. So if the home is in the name of a trust, an LLC, or corporation, then there's a document called the RCSD. That typically was incorporated into the agreement. In that case, you wouldn't need to fill out this section properly, but for this section, it actually is going to be filled out where we don't need to have the RCSD. So the printed name of the seller is the actual name of the trust. Let's say if it's a trust. So Jim Smith Real Estate That's the actual name of the trust. So that's the printed name of the seller. But who is the authorized signature? Authorized signer.
You have to check entity sellers in order for that to activate those other boxes there.
Okay.
There you go.
And the name of the authorized signer is John Smith, trustee. Is that correct, Mark?
Yes.
As an example. And then that will auto-populate into that. So when this person signs on behalf of the trust, he will sign as John Smith, trustee. And that's how the DocuSign will be sent out.
The thing to remember in this section is if it's a trust, you check the box that says entity sellers, and then you also complete 25(3), which is where it says the name of the legally authorized signer is, and you also complete 25(4), if a trust, identify seller as trustees. So this next section would be the legal name of the trust, or if it was a probate, you'd put the name of the probate case number.
Right here.
And that would be yeah, exactly. That's the legal name of the trust. And then you have the other thing to remember is that when you have an entity signer, you have 3 places to sign: signature by, printed name of seller, and printed name of legally authorized signer. If you have just a regular person that's a seller, and you don't check the entity box, and it's just the 2 signature lines: signature by and printed name of seller. So when you complete this 25 section correctly, meaning section 3, 4, and the checkbox for printed name and entity, you do not need the RCSD form. If it doesn't get done correctly, then that RCSD form is needed to make that correction to the listing agreement. And the purchase agreement works in a similar manner.
And no, if you screw it up, Mark will put in the initial review what you need to do correctly. So we got you covered either way. So that's okay. And know that it might not be perfect your first time.
Yeah.
It only takes you once to learn, and you're like, oh, that's how I need to do it. Provided you read the review messages and act upon it accordingly. Any questions on filling out a listing agreement if it's in the name of a trust? You guys have this section down. Okay. And then this little box right here says additional signature addendum attached card form ASA. Let's say that there was 4 sellers that are on the agreement and you just can't fit everybody on in the seller name section. You would add this form, but let's say you can still put up to 4 at the very top, up to 4 names, and it auto populates into this section, and then you just set up a DocuSign where they each sign in their appropriate areas. Broker signature, real estate firm, Keller Williams, San Diego Metro, or an address, and our DRE license number, which is 01295699. And then you would enter your name here. Okay. Why is this? There. And then email address. And then my DRE license number.
Which would be the listing agent's DRE license number. You know, Robert is the listing agent in this case, so that would be your information if it was your listing.
And then the next section is 2 brokers with different companies are co-listing the property. So
this happens occasionally, but
Occasionally.
rarely. We don't really recommend it because it's risky for both brokerages, creates some risk. But so if you have a situation arise where someone proposes co-listing a property with you and that other person's from a different brokerage, talk to us about it. And there's some solutions that we might be able to come up with for that.
okay. So in fairness of time, I'm going to go really quick through some of the sections. because it's getting on 225, and I have a meeting soon. So seller's advisory is attached to the end, basically says, hey, seller, you're selling your house. So we advise you to disclose what your disclosure duties are, your statutory duties are. If there's a death on the property, this is everything you need to do as a seller. So that's what the seller advisory is for.
This is the seller's job description, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then a new form that came out last year is the California Consumer Privacy Act Advisory Disclosure and Notice. Another form, but it's basically discloses to them their certain rights for their private and personal information. That's the easiest way to explain it. All right, so let's get back to another form that you need to, that I want to introduce, and it's called the SLIC. And this is in your templates, and it's the seller's listing information checklist. This form is a form you give to the seller of the listing and have them fill out. And it's everything about the property that the seller has knowledge of, like the title, what are the loans and obligations, what is the HOA, their contact information and the HOA payments, is there a tenant on the property? Did they do a pest control inspection? If so, how much is the cost for the corrective work? Are there any reports they have? What is the square footage? And any special showing conditions? So these questions seem simple enough, but they're there to protect you. So for an example, loans and obligations. It would be important, as remember in the section that the seller warrants that they have the ability to sell the property and there's no liens on the property that they're aware of. But let's say they didn't know there was a lien on the property and they didn't fill this out, and we enter escrow with somebody, and now we can't sell. And so now the seller's at fault, but they can't go back and make a claim to us because we asked them in advance, tell us all about your property. That's what this form does. It's a risk management tool for you to prevent the seller from coming back and suing you for failure to provide your fiduciary duty. And I think we covered everything on here during the, except for the Avid listing agent. That's your agent's visual inspection disclosure that is required to have that. You should have that done when you take the listing, just easier, get it out of the way, because it needs to be part of the disclosure packet with the TDS. So, and there's reasons for that.
The typical, seller, or the typical purchase agreement calls for the seller to deliver all these disclosures to the buyer within the first 7 days after acceptance. So you as the listing agent have to provide that form, that AVID-LA form, as a part of that. So you can't wait until like the 29th day of escrow to do your AVID-LA. So it has to happen. It's concurrent with the time that the seller has, 7 days typically.
Thank you, Mark. And I think that's it. Does anybody have any final questions?
Everyone's brain is like,
Well, mine's mush too for the last hour and a half. Mine's complete mush. All right, we'll see you guys this Thursday at 1:30, or what is it? 1 o'clock your
1
time.
o'clock. Yeah. Thank you for attending, everyone.